It's my Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and on this week's episode, a surprise Star Wars Disney Plus movie, most watched out of the entire franchise. I don't think it's too surprising. I'll share with you what the movie is, though. Promotion for The Acolyte is underway ahead of its debut coming up at the beginning of June, and why, if we want more Star Wars content, and specifically big screen Star Wars, the fandom has got to chill out. We have to let a little bit of our fandom go if we're going to get more good content. I'll explain. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. As always, if you want to support my Nerd World and you like to read, check out the EMBARK science fiction space opera series, available on Amazon. Just search for EMBARK and Jon, Jon Justice on Amazon.com.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My Nerd World.
Just let it in.
And welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice, here for another Star Wars show episode. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I greatly appreciate it. If you don't already subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to the show on, I hope you'll go and do that. And if you happen to be enjoying this on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube as well. I've taken a bit of a break from my sort of overhype of Star Wars as of late. I've still been watching some Star Wars content here and there, but I've kind of turned my attention over to another space opera franchise, one that heavily influenced Star Wars, and that would be Dune. I've just finished up a rewatch of Dune 1. My Dune Part 2 Blu-ray arrived in the mail this week. I'm really looking forward to sitting down and watching that film again. And doing my first rewatch of the Denis Villeneuve Dune, and I've watched that movie several times now, but my first rewatch since seeing Dune Part 2 in theaters, and I saw it twice in theaters. It really brought to the forefront the mythology inside of Dune now that I can see the story in its complete context. I had really wanted to watch both movies back to back, but to have that take up some 6 hours of my life, I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to carve out that kind of time. So I decided, all right, I'll move through Dune Part 1 this week and then set up to watch Dune Part 2 this coming weekend. And again, it's just interesting to me when I'm watching Dune, having never read the books. I need to do that. I have not read the books, though. But watching Dune again and just being reminded of just how much influence George Lucas pulled from the Dune stories. It really is, and it makes it for a really even more enjoyable watch, apart from just the fantastic storytelling of Dune and what Denis Villeneuve was able to create with this franchise. My wife's not nearly as into it. She finds them boring, not nearly as interesting as I do, but like I tend to look at the Star Wars content when we get more Star Wars content and how it adds context to that which came before it. Seeing both movies now and really looking forward to seeing Dune Part 2, because I loved the first part, but I really enjoyed Dune Part 2 even more. And knowing what happens to Paul Atreides and his own story arc and his own hero's journey that ends up very different than what happens to Luke Skywalker, as I have talked about in previous episodes. It really is just some fantastic science fiction storytelling, and it gets me excited for what we could potentially get in the future, and also a little bit worried about what we may get in the future. And I'll talk more about this when I get through a few of the news items of the day relating to a comment that I heard on the Big Picture podcast from the Ringer Network I listened to a podcast, and they were talking about the most recent Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the fourth installment in the most recent Planet of the Apes iteration. There are 9 movies in total in the Planet of the Apes franchise. I was unaware there were that many. I've seen the original Planet of the Apes, but I don't believe, at least I don't remember seeing any of the 60s going into the 70s as sequels. Certainly saw Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes, own all of the most recent Planet of the Apes films, and really enjoyed Kingdom of Planet of the Apes, and I'll share with you some of my thoughts on it as I get into that other part of the fandom of the podcast, including how Kingdom of Phantom of the Apes actually has a lot in common with Star Wars, which I thought was interesting. I hadn't really picked up on it until I heard this commentary on the Big Picture podcast. And so I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let's get into some of the news items this week on the show.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So a couple different articles on this. I just pulled the yahoo.com version. A surprise Star Wars movie is Disney Plus's most watched out of the whole franchise. One rather surprising Star Wars movie has risen above them all and has become Disney Plus and their most streamed piece of content out of the entire franchise. And it's not The Empire Strikes Back, they say jokingly. It's Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. It suddenly had a burst in popularity according to multiple sources. The Phantom Menace is now the most viewed Star Wars movie on the streamer worldwide, as reported by Variety. And this comes right after the movie's 25th anniversary. So I don't find this surprising in the least bit, for a couple of different reasons, including the upcoming Acolyte show. So you have the anniversary of The Phantom Menace. It's being re-released in theaters. A lot of people are not spending money at the box office because they pay money for these streaming platforms. And so, because of that, they go and they watch them at home. And I've seen this, this has happened in my own life. If I'm perusing Sling or before DirecTV and I see a movie that pops on there, and I'm like, oh, I haven't seen that movie in a long time, and I own it, I'll go and I'll watch it, or I know it's streaming somewhere. When I listen to the Rewatchables podcast, and they talk about a film that I haven't seen in a long time, I want to go and watch that film. It happened just this week with Jerry Maguire. This week on the Rewatchables was the Jerry Maguire podcast. And listening to them talk about this movie that I watched a ton when I was much younger. Don't own the Blu-ray when it came out and came out on DVD. I do own the DVD, and I'll watch it on DVD. I grabbed it out of my collection, and I threw it up with my queue of movies that I want to watch. And so, considering so much commentary around the Phantom Menace, this year I thought that the May the 4th be with you, May 4th holiday was executed better than it had been in years past by Lucasfilm and Disney Plus and the owners of the franchise. There was a lot of attention around the re-release of Phantom Menace, and I think a lot of people went to the Disney Plus streaming platform to go and watch it as opposed to going to the box office like I did and others did. Still brought in some $20 million domestically. The other reason why I think there's quite a bit of talk around it is because of the new Acolyte series, which I am cautiously optimistic about. As I've said, I had tremendous hope for this when it was first announced, a dark side-centric story set before the events of the Phantom Menace. Then when I got more into following the director, what they'd been a part of before, all of the controversies that Disney has been dealing with, my excitement tended to, I backed off my excitement. Seeing the first teaser didn't really help me at all, but seeing the full trailer and that extended clip from what I imagine is one of the opening scenes of episode 1 of The Acolyte, after the big screen viewing on May the 4th of The Phantom Menace, I'm genuinely excited for this show. And because the closest piece of content in the storytelling is The Phantom Menace, it makes sense that people would be going and visiting The Phantom Menace ahead of The Acolyte. I think the bigger reason is because of the re-release on the big screen and people that didn't go see it in the theater decided to watch it online and revisit it. But, The Phantom Menace is also a movie that, while it disappointed a lot of fans when it was released, people have really come around on that film, and I've talked about that a ton on the show. I really enjoyed my experience watching it again on the big screen. I know that I had a friend of mine who disagreed with me with regard to Jar Jar, but my opinion of Jar Jar, that was probably one of the most enjoyable experiences that I had of watching Jar Jar in The Phantom Menace. It didn't bug me nearly as much as it had in the past, and he never really bothered me that much. I understood what Lucas and his intention was with that character. These are still movies that are for kids. But my 17-year-old, he was chuckling throughout the whole film and seemed to enjoy it. So it's nice to see the popularity around Star Wars continue. I want that to continue. I think the fandom needs to back off, and I'll get to that here in just a moment. But speaking of the Acolyte and why I think some people have been watching The Phantom Menace with the Acolyte, I do have a quick story with regard to that series, which debuts here in just a few weeks.
This is not going to go the way you think.
The Acolyte will apparently be a gateway to Star Wars, and you don't need to know anything about the franchise to watch it. Now, this is according to an article, SFX magazine, and according to the producers, Rain Roberts and Simon Emanuel, in the new issue, the pair of producers opened up about making an interplanetary detective drama. Set in the High Republic, it marks the furthest back in time that Star Wars live action has ever gone on screen. However, you don't need to be familiar with all the details of that era from the extended universe to tune in. It's a gateway. You don't need to know anything about Star Wars to be able to drop in, Emmanuel tells us. Co-producer Roberts adds that this has been one of the best parts of making the show. That's been the most fun aspect, because we're not backing into anything that's pre-decided, he explains. They're new characters. All of their fates were up to Leslie Headland, the showrunner, and the writing room. So it's going to be really fun. I hope to see where they go. A lot of the series is still shrouded in mystery, but we do know some big details of what to expect. As teased in the synopsis, the action begins when a former Padawan reunites with her Jedi Master. They come together after a series of crimes across the galaxy bring danger to their door, but they soon discover that forces they confront are more sinister than first expected. Amanda Stenberg, Lee Jung-jae, Manny Jacinto, Daphne Keane, and Jodie Turner-Smith all star. So again, I'm incredibly curious to see if the Acolyte avoids some of the issues that a lot of Disney Plus streaming content has had as of late. As I said, I'm genuinely excited based off of some of the trailers that I've seen. And there's been some TV spots that have come out that have given us more footage than what we even received in that initial trailer. And there's a lot of promotion around this show. There kind of needs to be, for the very reason that article even exists, and that is there's not a reference point in the show yet in terms to draw people in. These are all new characters. Now, my speculation is Yoda will appear. He's around during this time. He appears in the High Republic literature. Many books have been written within this time period or before this time period, and Yoda is in those books. So it makes sense that Yoda will be in the Acolyte as well. I think it's smart that they're not marketing him at all. I imagine his inclusion in the series would probably be something more of a cameo, but I expect Yoda's going to be in it. But this is a brand new part of the universe and a part of the timeline that we've never explored before. And there's a lot of promotion around it, and that's the reason why. And the whole idea of you don't have to have watched anything prior to Star Wars to get into it, clearly what they mean by that, because my initial reaction of that headline was that you would be completely well-versed in Star Wars lore by just watching this show. And what I think they're really trying to say is you don't need any backstories. You won't have to have fallen Obi-Wan Kenobi or Ahsoka or Andor. You don't have to have been exposed to any other prior content, but a general understanding of the Star Wars universe is probably necessary, I would imagine, unless they're going to give us a complete refresher. But based off of the rumored runtime of these episodes being somewhere around 30 minutes, I doubt we're going to be getting a lot of backstory Star Wars content. Most people know what the Star Wars universe is about, and so I doubt they're going to waste a lot of time explaining it, but you just won't have to have seen a whole bunch of other shows to be able to follow this, like you would, say, watching Ahsoka. And that was one of the complaints that people had. If you hadn't been paying attention to Rebels and weren't well versed in that series, you might be lost on those particular characters, whereas with the Acolyte, you won't be. And this brings me to something that I thought was really interesting in this other podcast that I listened to, just relating to the fandom. And I wanted to make this point.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
So I'm listening to the Big Picture podcast. They're talking about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, a movie that I quite enjoyed. It takes place some 200 years after the War for the Planet of the Apes, and I enjoyed all three of those movies, Rise, Dawn, and War. I thought that's a really fantastic trilogy. I was afraid that Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes was going to be something more akin to what we've seen when these popular franchises have gone and added on a fourth movie when that wasn't expected. For some reason, Toy Story 4 pops into my mind. There was such a definitive end of Toy Story 3 that seems kind of like an add-on. The most recent Ghostbusters, which I enjoyed both of the new films, but Afterlife, feels like, okay, we're trying to take advantage of this, and a lot of people will point to the Star Wars sequel trilogy as this. So I was wondering, all right, this is odd. We're going to be jumping some 200 years into the future. Is it going to live up to what we saw in those previous films? And it absolutely did. A different director, Wes Ball. Wes Ball directed the Maze Runner films, and he did a fantastic job. For a 2.5-hour movie, I wasn't bored. I was locked in from the get-go. And considering that the movie is really all about the apes, you spend all your time with the apes. The humans have very little to do with this. They did an amazing job of keeping you captivated, watching their story unfold. It does have a lot of overtones to Star Wars, the original Star Wars, A New Hope, a hero's journey, the wise old sage that he comes in contact with. I don't want to say much more because I don't want to spoil anything for you. Right up to the female protagonist in this going on the adventure. But it totally works and sets up for what could be an interesting run of new Planet of the Apes films. I wouldn't really consider myself a fan, doing that thing with my fingers, of the Ape series, but I guess I am, and especially what they did in this movie. But the point that the host made on the show was something that I wanted to mention on the podcast this week. And they got into a conversation of how, we're looking at, 6 years? How many years is it going to be before we get another big screen Star Wars movie? And yet, other franchises have been able to pump out movies, other IPs, within that period of time. They've made less money, but they've still been successful, and they still continue to make movies. And the Apes franchise is a good example of that. This is the second movie since we've gone through, since that horrible time period, and since the release of The Rise of Skywalker. Now, the Planet of the Apes movies don't make nearly as much money as Star Wars, and therein lies the problem. The point that one of the hosts made was that the Star Wars fandom clutches their pearls so tightly relating to Star Wars that we look at something like Solo as being a massive box office failure. Now, that being said, there is the money that is spent on these films. And so they have to recoup those dollars. But there also is this ridiculous expectation that every single Star Wars movie is going to be $1 billion film. And when it doesn't live up to that, the fandom goes and rips apart that particular piece of content. And that rings true for The Rise of Skywalker. And it made a lot of money, but of course, because of the very vocal fandom, it didn't tick all of their specific boxes. That movie gets a lot of unnecessary criticism, in my opinion, and unfortunately, it, in my view, keeps Disney and Lucasfilm specifically from creating more content. We probably could have had films right now, but they're so afraid of what's going to happen if they don't put out exactly the right product, because the fandom gets so enraged when it doesn't live up to their expectations that they hold off on making any content, and we as fans suffer because of that. Now, I say all of that knowing that none of that is going to change. There's no way the fandom is changing. As the fandom gets older, I think there will more than likely be sort of a switchover relating to that type of mentality. There are still a lot of individuals my age growing up on the original trilogy that have these high expectations and simply refuse to go and enjoy anything that doesn't match exactly what they expect and want to see in a piece of Star Wars product. I've had my own issues with Star Wars content. I've mentioned that before, but I've recently been doing a rewatch of Kenobi in light of watching The Phantom Menace again and getting excited for The Acolyte. And while I still have my issues with that live-action show, I've been able to look past that and enjoy it for what it is. I think they could have done a better job. I think Kenobi suffered because of the time in which it was made and going through that particular era of the pandemic. A lot of content suffered. But I've even tried to put aside my own personal differences and just enjoy it for what it is. It's Star Wars. And it may not, make a lot of sense sometimes, or the production value may be lower than what I want, or the acting may be lower than what I want, but it really is what you make it in the end. And if I can sit there and be entertained and look past all that, I can. It's why I love the Ahsoka series so much, and yet a portion of the fandom, doesn't like that either. I think if the fandom were to chill out, we'd be able to get more content. And perhaps Star Wars doesn't need to be looked at and shouldn't be looked at as this franchise that needs to just absolutely make all this money and everybody must love. Because people seem to accept when these Planet of the Apes movies come out, and they go and they watch them and they enjoy them. It does well at the box office and they move on. It doesn't do spectacular, but the studios make money. It is a really solid movie. I would love to get a Star Wars movie on par with the amount of entertainment that I got in A Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. But unfortunately, the fandom keeps Lucasfilm and Disney from, making any sort of content like that, accepting that it's only going to make, $600 million or $700 million. Maybe one day that'll change. I'm not holding my breath, but I wish the fandom would chill out, because I think we would get more Star Wars content, and it would probably be good content as well. Sometimes when you try too hard, right, it doesn't end up working out the way that you had hoped, and I think that's been a problem with some of the content as well. As always, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube if you happen to be enjoying the show there.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
And lastly, Ray 2017 writes in this week, staying on the subject of The Last Jedi, it has also been announced in another source that The Last Jedi is the most watched movie in Disney Plus, despite the endless amount of debate and heated interweb discussion. Oh, interesting. I wonder if it was prior to the uptick in views for The Phantom Menace. Like it, love it, or hate it, we can all thank The Last Jedi for all of its contributions to keep this franchise in the conversation. Everything else will be polarizing going forward. Hopefully not too much in the real world, but Episode 8 so far has taken the cake and wins the Nobel Prize in that it's unforgettable. Yeah, I don't doubt that. I mean, I don't deny that at all. It's a movie that I still love and enjoy. And that's an interesting little stat. I had not seen that before, but thank you, Ray 2017. I appreciate it. All right. I would also appreciate it that you would check out my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. If you like to read, check out my series. Written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. All new covers available, by the way. I switched them back, so I'll just say that. If you haven't checked out the new covers yet, I hope you'll go and do that. 7 books in all in the series, available in ebook, hardcover, paperback, audiobook, free on Kindle Unlimited as well at Amazon.com. Just search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. Again, I wrote this series because of my love of Star Wars, my desire to create my own storytelling inspired off of what George Lucas did, and the science fiction stories that I read and the movies that I watched as a kid growing up. There's a little bit of those 80s and 90s romances in there, a lot of really cool technology because I love spaceships, all while telling an exciting, action-packed, and I'd like to say heartfelt. I try to inject a lot of family into the story. There's a bit of romance as well. So I hope you'll head on over to Amazon.com and check out my series. The description for book 1 is as follows. Katha's father died 1 year ago. Yesterday, he gave her the key to saving humanity. She just doesn't know it yet. With interstellar travel possible, pilots are the future, and Katha Morrow trained to be the best. But when an industrial accident sets off an apocalyptic chain of events, she'll need more than her skills to survive, as a tyrannical enemy emerges to exploit the disaster and gain control. Katha's given a fighting chance when a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father leads her and fellow pilot Taft Guardia to what may be the only hope of ending the conflict. While Taft and a ragtag squadron of Earth's evacuees fight to save humanity from annihilation, Katha must solve the mystery of what her father left behind before it's too late. Again, it's great for ages 11 plus, but I did write these for adults, but think Star Wars in terms of the violence, and there's no language or anything explicit whatsoever. So treat yourself a friend or a family member with science fiction. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. Again, ebook, Kindle Unlimited, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. In the meantime, I hope you'll check out the podcast again next week, and I hope wherever you are happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.